So this morning, we're looking at a very famous story in the Bible, the road to Emmaus. And the road to Emmaus story is one of three stories that happened after Jesus' resurrection. What is so amazing about these stories, Luke 24, is all that's left out. In Acts chapter 1, which was also written by Luke, Luke tells us that Jesus was with the disciples for 40 days. 40 whole days. So Luke and the other disciples spent over a month with God himself. Luke probably could have written a whole other book of the Bible just in those 40 days, but he didn't. Luke decided to share all the things that happened in those 40 days in three stories. Think of all the things he could have shared from those 40 days. Instead, he just decides to share these three stories. When Mary meets Jesus, when Jesus appears to the apostles, and the one we're going to look at this morning, the road to Emmaus. He only shares these three stories. Surely Luke had all of these stories that he could have put in, but he selected these three over all the others. So these three stories are extremely profound. These three stories are what Luke decided to put in over all the others. And so the story we're going to look at today, the two men on the road to Emmaus, is one of these three profound stories. This is an important story. And we're going to look at today why it's so important. And so I want to look today at four main things that is so amazing that this story tells us. The first two have to deal with Jesus' resurrection itself. And then the last two have to deal with Jesus himself. So the first two, resurrection. Last two, Jesus himself. And so we've already read the story, so I won't bother going through it again. Thanks for bearing with me to change that at the last second. So we're just going to jump in here. So there's so many important details in this chapter, but the first detail I want to talk about is about Jesus' resurrection. The first thing I want to talk about is that everyone in that day knew about the resurrection. Look at verse 14. It says the two men were talking with each other about everything that had happened. What are the things that had happened? Well, just look earlier in Luke 24. Look at the section right before this story. The resurrection. So what are the things that had happened? Jesus' death and resurrection. That's what they're talking about. And as they're talking about these things, Jesus, who at this point is keeping the men from knowing that it's him, he knows what they're talking about. But he asks in verse 17, what are you discussing together as you walk along? Notice what one of the men says. Cleopas, he says, are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days? Are you a visitor? You must be a visitor, or else you would know these things. Cleopas is shocked that the man walking with them hasn't heard about the resurrection of Jesus because everyone knew about it and everybody was talking about it. Having faith in the resurrection is not a leap in the dark. It's not a blind leap of faith. It's a leap, but it has evidence. There's evidence. Notice all the things that the two men tell Jesus while he walks with them about Jesus. They knew these things about him. He was a prophet. He was powerful in word and deed. He performed many miracles. He said amazing things. There was definitely something special about this guy, and everybody knew it. He was crucified, even though he was innocent. The women went and found an empty tomb, and there were witnesses who claimed that they saw him alive. There were real eyewitnesses to this. Everyone was talking about what was happening, and the evidence was irrefutable. It was so overwhelming, even the enemies, even those who would disagree, couldn't refute this evidence that people saw this happen and people were talking about it. In Acts chapter 26, Paul defends Christianity before Festus and Agrippa, two Roman officials, Festus and Agrippa, 26 years after the resurrection happened. So Paul says to them, look at all the evidence that happened. Look at the eyewitnesses. Look at all these things that people were talking about, all that occurred in those times. Jesus was a man who claimed to be God. He performed miracles. He helped heal people. He was crucified and rose from the dead. People even claim to have seen him themselves. How can you refute that? How can you refute someone's experience? And in response to this, Festus, one of the Roman emperors, says in verse 24, "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning has driven you insane." He says, Paul's crazy. And then Paul says, "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus." Paul says, "What I'm saying is true and reasonable." But what is really interesting is that after Paul says this to Festus, so he's talking to both Festus and Agrippa. So first he's talking to Festus, but then he turns to Agrippa. And Agrippa was a king over Israel, over Jerusalem, during the time when the resurrection happened. So Agrippa was there. He was in the culture when everyone was talking about it. So Agrippa knows that everybody in that day knew what was happening. Even he did. And he couldn't even refute the evidence. So he motions to Agrippa, and Paul says, the king, Agrippa, is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. It was not done in a corner. Everyone knew about the resurrection because it was not done in a corner. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone knew about it. And even Agrippa can't deny it. Agrippa's response is a joke. He responds to Paul with a joke because he doesn't know what to say, because he can't refute it. There's evidence for the resurrection. It's not a blind leap of faith. Everyone knew about the resurrection. There's evidence. Next, I want to look specifically at the two men who were walking to Emmaus. Notice how sad these two men are. They're walking along, talking about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, and notice what their response is when Jesus asks them what they're talking about. Verse 17, what are you discussing together as you walk along? And this is their response. They stood still, and their faces downcast. They were so shook up about Jesus dying, they were so distraught about it, that they stopped walking altogether. They stood still, and their faces downcast. They're very sad. So why are they so sad? What are they sad about? Because they're looking at a life without the resurrection. This is point number 2 about the resurrection. These two men were so sad because they looked at life without a resurrection. They looked at their own lives without a resurrection and looked at Jesus' life without a resurrection. If there was no resurrection, then there's no hope. And death is the end of it all. When we die, that's it. Then there's nothing more. And that's why they're sad. Anyone who looks at death and says that this is all there is will also become downcast because it's depressing. It's hopeless. Anyone who says this life is all there is, anyone who thinks that everything ends at death will be very sad. There's a famous psychiatrist by the name of Ronald May who wrote a book called My Quest for Beauty. And he was not a religious person, but one night he was at Mount Athos in Greece. So he was on a vacation in Greece, and he stumbled upon an all-night Eastern Orthodox Easter service. And so he decided to go in and sit and take part to see what the local religion was doing. And at the end, the priest stood up and said, "The Lord has risen." And everyone in response said, "He has risen indeed." And apparently Ronald May joined in with the crowd as they all said this. And so he said, "He has risen indeed." And when he said it, he said, "Suddenly, I was seized by a moment of spiritual reality. What would it mean for our world if he truly was risen and death isn't the end?" You say it's a leap of faith to believe in the resurrection, but I say it's an even bigger leap of faith to believe in a life without the resurrection. The average American says, when you die, you rot. That's it. When we die, that's it. It's over. We're all here by chance. There's no overarching purpose to life. There's nothing after death. But yet, they also say that we must take care of the poor, treat others with dignity, fight for the oppressed, and push for justice. Talk about a leap of faith. There's no purpose to life, but yet we must do all of these great things. But why? You've got all these people in our world who don't believe that there's any meaning to life, and yet they all go out and protest things like income inequality and push for ethical treatment of the poor. They fight for all these virtuous things, but they would say, if asked, there's no real meaning to life. If you went up to them and asked them why we should care about these things, I don't think any of them would be able to give you an answer. Look at all the leaps we're making. We make leaps every day. Faith is a part of life. Once we start realizing some of the ridiculous leaps we make, the resurrection doesn't actually seem that bad after all. It's a much bigger leap of faith to live a life without the resurrection. But what if he's risen indeed? What if there is hope? Let's move on to the third point I want to make from this passage, dealing with Jesus himself. Let's look at verse 30. 3-31. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. The men didn't see Jesus for who he was until he broke bread in front of them. They didn't know who he was until he broke bread. Bread, as we learned from the Last Supper, is symbolic for the breaking of Jesus' body on the cross. It is symbolic for the suffering that he endured. What we learn from this is that we won't see Jesus for who he really is until we understand that Jesus had to die for us. Lots of people today just want to say that, oh man, Jesus was just a good guy. He was just a good teacher. He was just an amazing person, but that's it. He didn't really die for mankind. He didn't really rise from the dead. He was just a good guy. But you will never understand really who Jesus was until you understand that he had to die and rise again. Look at what Jesus says in verse 26. He says, "Did not the Christ who had to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Jesus had to die. There wasn't any other option. It says he had to do this. It had to happen. But why did Jesus have to die? Remember, we looked at this last week. Why did Jesus have to die? Jesus had to die to forgive man of all the wrongs he's ever done. Jesus had to die to free us from our guilt and make us innocent. We're tainted with sin and can't live with God. But Jesus' sacrifice cleans us so we can live with him forever. So many people don't understand the gospel. Even people that go to church every week still don't understand it. A fundamental issue why people don't believe the gospel is that they don't understand that God had to die and rise for them. We all think we're on the good side, but we're really not. We all think the problem's out there, but actually the problem is in us. That's where the problem is. Romans 5:10 says that while we were God's enemies, Jesus died for us. We're made clean and blameless because of what he had to do. And he had to do it, or else I couldn't live with him forever. You couldn't live with him forever. Jesus had to die to save you. Are you offended by that? Is that offensive? That you would need him to die for you? Then you don't understand the gospel. Are you trying to save yourself? You have to see that you're not a good person. You're a spiritual slave. And until you believe that, you will never understand the gospel. The eyes of the two men were opened once they saw Jesus breaking the bread. And our eyes can be opened once we understand that Jesus had to be broken for us. Now finally, the fourth point, last point that I want to talk about today from this passage dealing with Jesus himself. Notice verse 21. The two men express their expectations to Jesus about him, but they say, but we had hoped that he was the one who's going to redeem Israel. The two men said, man, we really did think he was the Messiah. We really thought that he was going to do it. But then, he died on a cross, so that must disqualify him. He couldn't have been the Messiah because he died, right? But then notice Jesus' response to them. Verse 25 and following. This is important. Look at this. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And then catch this. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So why did Luke tell us this story? Why did Luke put in the road to Emmaus at the end of his gospel? Why was this one of the three stories that he decided to tell? The reason why this story is told to us is because this is something that can happen to us now. Notice how Jesus never says, hey guys, look, it's me, Jesus. He never says, hey guys, see, look, hey. Notice what he does to make them understand who he is. He opens the scriptures. You can experience the living Christ. You can open your eyes and remove the veil from your face if you open the scripture and see. The two men said, did not our hearts burn within us as he opened the scripture? But Jesus didn't just explain the scripture. He didn't just explain it. In verse 27, this is what he says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So at this time, remember, there's no New Testament. It's just the Old Testament. But yet he says it's talking about him. But I don't see the name Jesus in the Old Testament anywhere. But Jesus says it's about him. The Old Testament is about him. This will change the way you read the Bible. Do you struggle to read the Bible? Do you struggle to read the Old Testament, to understand the Old Testament? Do you ever read through Leviticus and you're just like, okay, I don't see why this is relevant to me at all? You need to understand that Jesus himself said, I came not to abolish the law, I came not to abolish the Old Testament, but to fulfill it. He fulfills it. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Jesus himself is all over the Old Testament. You just have to know how to look. This will change the way you read the Old Testament. There's two ways to read the Bible. There's a moralistic way, and there's a Jesus lens way. We need to read the Bible in a gospel-centered way. The gospel is the theme of the whole Bible, even the Old Testament. All the law and the prophets all point towards Jesus. Even Leviticus does. Let's look at the story of David and Goliath, for example. Everyone knows this story. If you read the story of David and Goliath in a moralistic way, you read the story and you say, this is about me. This story is about me. You read the story and you come to the conclusion that I can be strong if I do good things to have God help me live a good life. If I do enough good things, then God will love me and then I can have a good life. But the Old Testament is not about you. It's about Jesus. Stop reading the Bible like it's about you and read it through a Jesus lens. If you read the story of David and Goliath through a gospel-centered lens, you learn that salvation comes through weakness. Little old David goes in to fight instead of his army. If David loses, they're all done for. But if he wins, not only is honor bestowed among David, it is bestowed among the whole army. If David achieves glory, they do too. David was Jesus. But our greater David, Jesus himself, died against the giant. But he died in his triumph, and we reign in victory with him, and we didn't even do anything to earn it. When you read the Bible through a Jesus lens, your heart will ignite and your faith will come alive. Boring stories that make no sense to you will come alive for you. You will finish your daily Bible reading saying the same thing that the two men said. Did not our hearts burn within us as he explained the Scripture, as he opened the Scripture to us? The Bible is not about you. It's about Jesus. And it's everywhere. Jesus is everywhere, even in the Old Testament. This is how we encounter Christ. I've been so overwhelmed by this concept of Jesus in the Old Testament that I want to start a new series on this very thing. I think it's so important that I'd love to start going through that. For the next several weeks, we're going to look at several Old Testament passages, and we're going to see how Jesus is in them. Even 2,000, 3,000 years before Jesus ever walked on the earth, he is all over the place, all over the Old Testament. And I hope this will encourage you to read Scripture more on your own. I hope it will encourage you to read the Bible, the Old Testament, more on your own, and change the way you read it. And I pray that it would lead you into a deeper understanding of the gospel. That Jesus died for you, and through his death we gain glory. We gain the glory that he deserved, so that we can live with him forever. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the gift of Scripture. Thank you that we can encounter you now just as much as the two men on the road to Emmaus encountered you. Lord, I pray that we would take in the gift of Scripture. It is such, it can be so easy to ignore it